I learned a lot about COVID. I learned it by really going to school. This is the real school.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this backstory on America and its presidency. I'm Dana Lewis. We want to focus as much as we can on foreign policy as Biden and Trump vie for the presidency in November. What will change? America and NATO, the U.S. and the Paris Climate Accords, Syria, Afghanistan, China. But perhaps nothing is more troubling than Trump undercutting American democracy. And how does that play in places like Belarus, where thousands are being arrested and freedom is in a chokehold by a dictator? Oh yes, and we can't forget Russia. On this backstory, U.S. foreign policy, and how it could look completely different in just a few months. Joseph Williams is in Washington, a reporter with U.S. News and World Report. He covers the White House, national politics. Hi, Joseph. Thanks for doing this.
Hi, good to see you.
Donald Trump riding her in a hermetically sealed car, pumped up on steroids, exposing Secret Service agents and others, to say hi to people and campaign a little bit outside Walter Reed Medical Center. I mean, everybody's head is spinning at this point. It's pretty remarkable. And I think from a medical point of view, it's pretty outrageous, at least the way we see it from here in London.
There are a couple of things that tick the outrage meter. The first and foremost is the fact that we're here at all, right? I mean, this is a president who abjectly denied the fact that this virus was harmful, took great pains to avoid wearing masks, saw anyone who wore a mask as somebody evidencing weakness, right? So number one, the fact that we're here in the first place is just, it's even hard to overstate how absurd and ridiculous that is. So that's number one. And number two, this man has the best medical advice and medical teams at his disposal. Yet for years, not years, but ever since the virus took place 6 months ago, he has refused.
It feels like years.
He feels like, it only feels like years, exactly. But he's refused the advice of medical professionals and had tried to downplay the virus, even though in private he admitted how horrible and how potentially deadly this virus is. So that's the second part that has people's heads spinning. The third part is that we can't get a straight answer from the White House about what his condition was, how bad it was, what's his condition now, what the general prognosis is.
No oxygen.
Exactly.
Now there is oxygen.
No oxygen. He's on steroids now. Yeah. Well, the steroids are good. He's on an experimental drug. He's on another drug that they're using only for the most extreme patients, but he could walk out of here tomorrow. We think he's doing so well that he's got the strength of 10 men. So there's a bunch of factors at work here that lead us to question whether or not we as Americans are being told the whole truth, whether or not the president has actually learned a lesson here, and whether or not this is going to be a situation that bears watching if he's going to relapse, because the virus happens very suddenly a lot of times, and if he's going to be in the clear, and if he's going to be able to exercise the judgment that a president of the United States needs to exercise.
I can tell you, after living through Prime Minister Boris Johnson's experience here, because he got COVID-19 after being pretty casual about the whole thing, and Britain, as a result, had the worst number of deaths in Europe. I mean, he originally got it, and then he didn't go into hospital for about 9 days. And then it became very serious. And then he was that close to being put on a ventilator, but he was on oxygen, and he said he came very close, to losing his life there. So, there is still a road to pave here in terms of Trump's recovery back. Maybe he goes home now, maybe he doesn't. But has it shifted the election debate now completely back, probably to where it should be, to COVID-19 and his handling of it?
There is no doubt that it has. Before then, we were talking about Supreme Court justices. Before then, we were talking about whether or not our tough guy president has what it takes to get the country back to where it was before he took office. But now COVID-19 is word one. You can't have a sitting president who is running for re-election hospitalized and not talk about that. So certainly the virus has reclaimed center stage. The open question is whether or not his message is going to remain the same, that this is all in the past and that the worst of it is behind us, and that I am strong and I'm in control, even though I got a virus that I was trying to tell everybody didn't exist and didn't matter. So his messaging on that almost certainly has to change.
In that video over the weekend, he said he learned a lot. He's learned a
learned
lot
a-
about the virus, and he's going to be sharing some of that. Any idea what on earth he learned that he wouldn't already know?
It's hard to tell, because if he learned a lot about the virus, that means his starting place was really not in a good place to begin with. If the leader of the free world, the leader of the country that's leading the world in the number of coronavirus cases and deaths, if he is only now learning about the virus, that speaks very ill of him. The second thing is, did he really learn a lesson? Because he's out parading around in his car, gathering, soaking up some love from some of his fans, putting Secret Service agents at risk unnecessarily. There was no need for him to do that. Yeah, granted, they were wearing hazmat suits, granted, they were wearing masks, but still, why do this? Why do this?
Look, we're of the same mind here. I think we both consider it a pretty dumb thing to do, but there are probably his followers who think that that was a great thing to do, that he came out and thanked people and showed that he's strong and that he's with them. And it plays very differently to Republicans.
Well, it plays very differently with Republicans, and also plays very well in states like Argentina, states like Venezuela, where you have a strongman leader. And we're the United States. We're not supposed to be that way. And if the Republicans are cheered by this, that says something very significant, I believe, about their party and where it is in the United States body politic. I mean,
you just helped me switch a little bit to foreign affairs and American foreign policy when you start talking about overseas, because when you talk about countries like Belarus, which are right now, ignited in accusations of fraudulent elections, and there are sanctions against the strongman President Lukashenko, who is jailing his opposition. And, America is not one of those countries. It is the country that normally wades in here and speaks with moral authority about democracy and freedom of speech and free and fair elections. But how can you expect America to do that now when Donald Trump is undermining the democratic process in November, saying that he may accept the result or he may not? It's full of these mail-in ballots. He's saying that's a stacked election, and he's not committing himself to a peaceful transition of power.
It's difficult to have any moral authority when we're that way, and you might have noticed that we have not talked all that much. At least he hasn't talked all that much publicly about Belarus, about Argentina, about Venezuela, and about all the states around the world that are struggling to maintain democracy. And on the contrary, he's cozied up to people like Duterte in the Philippines. He's talked admiringly of Vladimir Putin. He's talked a lot about how he wishes he were able to throw a military parade like Macron does in France, because these are all indications in his mind of strong authority and bold leadership. But it plays very differently in the United States, and it's very puzzling why he's gotten as far as he has with this kind of an underlying tone to his message.
Yeah, and he didn't speak out it's shocking that he didn't speak out on Navalny, the main opposition member who was poisoned with nerve agent in Russia. But, again, that's an example of him not willing to criticize Putin in any way or criticize the Kremlin. Can you talk to me about Biden? I mean, is Biden on foreign policy, like Russia, for instance, since we're talking about that, do you expect him to be much tougher than Trump has been?
I expect him to be much tougher than Trump has been on Russia. Are we going to head towards the brink of war? No. Is he going to be fondly talking about his pal Vladimir? No, I don't think he is. We're going to go back to a conventional foreign policy, I believe, trying to maintain and enhance democracy on the world, doing a few things that people don't really notice that might raise the hackles of some human rights advocates, but it's going to be very much more conventional, very much in the mold of Obama. However, there are things where Biden split with Obama, including Iraq. Very famously, Joe Biden wanted Iraq to be divvied up into 3 states and not have the U.S. maintain a presence there for long. People said, well, no, that's insane. We can't do that. There'll be ethnic violence, from here to kingdom come. And his view did not prevail. But there were some who remind us of that. And there are some of us who remind us that Joe Biden knows a lot of the world leaders, but his is a very centrist foreign policy. So I would not expect anything beyond boilerplate United States talking points about human rights and about advancing democracy, which, while turning a blind eye to some abuses among allies like the Saudis and the Middle East and the not Iranians, but the Israelis. We'll probably have a more hawkish stance on Iran, although we'll probably go back into the nuclear deal because that only makes sense. But it's going to raise a lot of
less
hackles.
hawkish than Trump.
It is less hawkish than Trump, but it's going to raise some hackles on the right. There are going to be some complaints about him acceding to Iran when everybody, including the Iranians, believe that this deal makes sense.
Carbon emissions, the Paris Accords. I mean, Biden has basically articulated that would America re-sign?
I believe they would, mainly because he is being forced to recognize, his left flank is forcing him to recognize that climate change is a thing. And the wildfires in California only underscore that. We've had significant weather events. We've had significant fires that speak to the need to get back into the Paris Accord. And the Paris Accord might not be enough. We might be there too late. So we're definitely going to be hearing more about climate change in a post-Trump presidency. But the question is whether or not we're able to do anything about it in time to save lives and property.
Afghanistan, really quickly, Donald Trump has tweeted, among many tweets from the hospital, "Peace through strength, bring our soldiers home." Now, he didn't say home from where, but he's probably talking about Afghanistan, and there's not very many left anyway. I think there's 5,500. They were going to bring them down to 3,500 by the November election. There are peace negotiations with the Taliban. Fat chance, in my personal opinion, that that's going to bring about real peace in Afghanistan. But again, on Afghanistan, he probably wants to get out. And Biden?
Absolutely. Biden probably will maintain some kind of a presence, mainly because it is in our best interest to do that. I mean, the Taliban negotiations with the Afghan government, they haven't been going really very well. And as soon as the U.S. leaves, all hell could potentially break loose. So I don't think he's going to hit the exit ramp quite as quickly as Trump is. But I do think there's going to be some discussion about maintaining a minimal footprint in the U.S. because this is the longest war that the U.S. has ever had. So I would expect if Biden continues on the centrist track, I would expect him to talk about removing troops. I just don't think that he would do it abjectly and do it in a way that could cause a very fragile government to collapse.
The biggest one I left for last, and that's China. So, I mean, it's really been Trump's punching bag on everything from trade to security, Taiwan. I mean, they've been overtly supportive of Taiwan. What do you think that Biden is going to change on China should he become the next president?
Interestingly, I don't think that much will change, at least as far as Taiwan and Hong Kong are concerned. I think that they will keep a very close watch on what happens over there. I think the Biden administration will do that. We're probably going to see a Susan Rice as Secretary of State. She very much is in the mold of Obama and the Obama years, where there will be a lot of talk about democracy. There'll be a lot of talk about protection from the Chinese. But Biden himself has also been using the Chinese as a punching bag. As a matter of fact, on the debate, one of those points that Trump tried to score is maintaining that China has eaten Biden's lunch. We don't necessarily think that that's true. We do know that Obama was not conciliatory towards China, but nor was he declaring them as a severe ally. As a matter of fact, on Obama's watch, the South China Sea bases started popping up. So expect Biden to draw a stricter line on China. He's probably not going to go hard, at least not to the brink of war, but he certainly will not let them go unchecked in their quest to expand power.
Joe, shifting back to the U.S., I want to leave it there with you, but do you think election night, a lot of people predicting chaos, a lot of people predicting that Trump will call his people to the street and to polling stations, and they'll say, don't allow those ballots, those mail-in ballots to be counted, that there could be violence. I mean, depending on where you stack up on this, you think you're going to have a result on election night, or are you going to have months of court battles and maybe street battles?
Well, I mean, I think that what will happen is going to be determined by how the vote goes early. I mean, so far, early votes have been at record numbers. In order to avoid that thing, to avoid any kind of unrest or questions, there's going to have to be a decisive victory or a decisive defeat by either one of the candidates. That's the only way I think that there will be unrest not taking place. I think that the potential for violence seems to be a lot more likely on the right, mainly because they are pro-gun, they are pro Second Amendment, and we've seen people on the right bringing guns to peaceful rallies. So I think that that's that's more likely in that instance. However, I don't think.
Well, I mean,
that
you could argue, and because he's called them out, he has called them.
I was going to say that he has actually called them out and has issued a clarion call, and he's kind of walked it back, but not especially vigorously. So I think that if we have a decisive result, he may try to challenge it in the court, but there may be some people who will talk him out of it. If it's a divided election with many votes left uncounted through the mail, I think that will hike the potential for chaos. And I think that if it's anything but a decisive victory, there will be potential for unrest, at least violence at most.
Joe Williams, a reporter with U.S. News and World Report. Joe, thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
All right, Anar Bata is also in London, where I am, and she's with the U.S. and America's program at Chatham House, a think tank in London. Hi, Anar. How are you?
Hi, Dana. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm good. How are you?
My head is spinning today because I'm watching drive-by coverage of Donald Trump, who left the hospital at the Walter Reed Medical Center and then, in a hermetically sealed vehicle, drove around with Secret Service agents waving at his supporters outside the hospital. And I'm just, like everybody else, a little breathless over it. I can't believe that he did it. And so many medical people are, condemning him for it. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised some really good points. I think at this point in time, it's hard to be surprised by what Trump will do next. As you say, yesterday on the 4th of October, he took a joyride outside of his hospital. He's gotten a lot of criticism for that recently, for endangering the Secret Service agents that were in the car with him. Apparently, the way that the car was sealed made it even more likely for the COVID particles to get past to Secret Service agents. But I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that, Trump, he likes the fanfare, he likes the attention. He's very concerned about his image. And I think he wants to show voters that he's very tough. He's not get overcome by this virus. We're less than a month to go until the election. So engaging with voters, especially in swing states, is very essential right now. And he's not going to have the opportunity to meet with them in person anymore or to stage his big rallies that were so popular in 2016. So I think that was his attempt at engaging with the voters, however reckless it was. And, the backlash that he's facing, his core supporters are still there defending him. So I'm not sure, despite the criticism, whether or not that move really hurt him.
Well, blame it on the steroids. The view from overseas on America's handling of COVID, and specifically Trump's handling of it. I mean, when you're sitting here in London, the view is a lot different than when you're in the US, I think. And so how do Europeans, and even here in Britain, where, there's been some maybe 65,000 excess deaths due to COVID-19, Britain's been hit hardest in Europe. How do you think people view what's going on in America?
So I think America's global image has really suffered quite dramatically, especially with coronavirus. I think, that was already starting to take a hit when Trump became president in 2017, and it has just dropped significantly since the COVID pandemic has started. I do think there is a difference between how it's perceived on the ground here and how it's perceived in America. So, his handling of it over here seems very chaotic, very mismanaged, not listening to science, not listening to facts, ignoring his advisors. I think, the European partners definitely are hoping for a change in administration.
Are people laughing at him?
Pandemic.
I mean, let's be honest about it. Do you think that people look at Trump? I mean, we've seen world leaders from Trudeau to Macron to Merkel, rolling their eyes when they're around him. I mean, is he laughed at in Europe, do you think?
I definitely don't think he's taken as seriously as a presidential candidate should be. I don't know if they're laughing so much as, recoiling in fear, because the U.S. does play a very important role as, the leader of democracy and the defender of freedom. And I think European partners are getting a bit worried by recent U.S. actions that seem to be undermining these values that the U.S. has stood for and European partners stand for. So I think, there is criticism of Trump in terms of whether or not he's a capable leader, but it's more so, what does this mean for our region? How does this impact our interests?
Yeah. I mean, I know
another 4 years of Trump
I know a lot of
Sorry.
diplomats and people based in different countries for the US who have worked on human rights, who have worked on free speech. And I think that they are, deeply alarmed that America has either withdrawn internationally or just has lost a lot of credibility. So, how does this play internationally when you have Trump on issues like the election, where he's undermining the American election, where he's saying that the mail-in ballots amount to election fraud, that maybe he's not going to accept the result, maybe there's not going to be a peaceful transition of power. I mean, and how does that play when you're watching things in Eastern Europe, like Belarus right now, where there are demonstrators out every weekend demonstrating against widespread election fraud carried out by the ex-president, Lukashenko?
Yeah, I mean, it's very concerning. I think, European partners definitely want to see America as a defender of democracy. As you mentioned, peaceful transition of power, that's a cornerstone of any democratic nation. Trump has already made it very clear that he's not going to accept whatever results come out if they're not in his favor. He's already stroking flames of elections and voter frauds and things like that. So, I mean, I think there are a number of different tactics that Trump has used to undermine different democratic institutions within the states and internationally, which is very concerning as populism and authoritarianism is on the rise. And, by being distracted with these internal divisions, that gives external actors like Russia more leverage in terms of manipulating what's happening in Belarus in their own favor. So it is worrying about what the future of democracies globally will be like if Trump gets reelected.
Do you think it sends a message anything goes? I mean, if it can go on in America, it can go on anywhere. And leaders like Lukashenko, and I mean, Putin does what he wants anyway. But I mean, leaders like Lukashenko think, if Trump's doing it, I can do what I want. And not only is America distracted, but their president's not going to stand up and criticize me. Look what he's doing in his own country.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it emboldens authoritarian actors. In the past, the U.S. would be considered the bulwark against these nefarious influences or these negative influences. I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. Trump has, cozied up to authoritarian leaders. He, has a reportedly very close relationship with Erdogan in Turkey. He's, not taken very aggressive measures against Russia. He didn't impose sanctions after reports came out that Russia had put bounties on U.S. soldiers' heads in Afghanistan. So there are a lot of different factors.
And Navalny, by the way, the poisoning of Navalny, the main opposition candidate in Russia, where Trump was asked over and over again about it. And he, basically danced around it and avoided answering. And we'll see about that later. And he didn't condemn it. There are other members of the government that have condemned it, but Trump specifically has not come out and condemned it.
Yeah, and that's, also worrying for European partners who want to have a united Western front against Russia. So we're seeing Germany and France very critical of Russia over the Navalny poisoning, but they don't have the backing of the U.S. and they might not trust the U.S. to partner with them.
Do you think Joe Biden's going to be a tiger? Do you think Joe Biden's going to be a tiger for Putin to deal with? Biden will be much tougher.
I think Biden will definitely be much tougher. He's already openly called Russia an opponent. He's already said that he's elected president in 2020, and there is evidence of Russia interfering in the U.S. election, which there is, that he would take a much harder line of action against them than Trump did. I think a second Trump term, bit of a tongue twister, sorry about that. A second Trump term would be in Putin's favor, very much so. Trump has, caused a lot of divisions within his European partners. He's constantly undervalued the role of NATO. He has given Russia a huge strategic victory within the Middle East. Biden has also said that he would have been much tougher in that area. He would not have abandoned the Kurdish allies and pulled out the U.S. troops as Trump did. So there are multiple different areas where we can see that Biden would operate a much tougher stance against Russia, including imposing sanctions and working with like-minded
because
partners.
President Obama generally, when you take a look at his report card at the end of his term, a lot of people thought he was soft in foreign policy areas. And you think Biden will be tougher?
I do think so. I think the fact that Obama was soft kind of empowered Putin to go a little bit further in terms of disinformation campaigns that we were seeing in 2016. Had Obama been a bit tougher on Russia, he might not have been as willing to do that. So I think, the Democrats have learned their lesson in a certain way and know that they now need to be a little bit tougher. The digital era has given Russia a lot more powers than they had before, a lot more influence than, they would have had 20 years ago. And those factors really need to be accounted for.
Talk to me about Biden and his, the Paris Accords and the reduction of carbon emissions. I mean, Trump basically is a global warming denier, and Biden has articulated some pretty clear goals, including carbon neutrality by 2050, which is like 10 years before China has come out with its plan now for 2060. Do you think Biden right away in the Paris Accords will re-sign America up and realign America with a lot of the countries who believe that global warming is rapidly taking place, and then America's got to get on board?
Yeah, I definitely think Trump will re-sign up to the Paris Accord. I think that will send a very clear signal to European partners that the last 4 years were just an aberration of U.S. policy and U.S. global leadership. Biden, I think it's very important for him to commit to a multilateral agenda to combat these major challenges that are affecting the entire world. One country can't go at it alone, but you do need major power in order to facilitate cooperation amongst other nations. And whether or not that's symbolic or actually hard power, either way, Biden's commitment to the Paris Accords will show the US's commitment to climate change and influence other powers to take them seriously as well.
You want to take a run at American foreign policy with regard to Iran?
I'm not familiar with Iran, if I'm being entirely honest. My assumption would be that Biden would attempt to negotiate with Iran and convince them to rejoin the JCPOA. I'm not sure how successful he would be. It would be hard to convince them that, something's not going to happen again with Biden's predecessor in terms of the U.S. pulling out of the agreement. There have been claims that Iran has also been involved in misinformation campaigns within the U.S. In favor of Biden.
And they're pretty substantial claims, including from intelligence agencies. So.
Yes, exactly. And, I do think Iranians are concerned about what a second Trump term of maximum pressure would do to their economy.
What about China?
In terms of how Biden would proceed. For China,
Biden is going to be softer. I mean, Trump always accuses him of being softer on China. Do you think that's fair?
I don't think that's fair. I do think that Biden will probably operate on a very tough on China approach, similar to Trump. I think he will attempt more engagement and more cooperation on China with certain issues. For example, potentially working with them to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, or sharing resources for something like a global pandemic. But he has made clear that his main priority is worker infrastructure at home. So it's not likely that he would take a softer approach. I think from what we saw in the debates, foreign policy wasn't a topic of the debate, but China continued to come up as a punching bag that each opponent would use. So it's become very politicized, and there has been a clear shift in the way the American public views China. I do think they see it more as a threat in terms of economically and technologically. So I think Biden recognizes that, and while understanding the need for engagement and cooperation on certain issues, will maintain a tough stance on things like trade and intellectual property theft.
Anar, coming back to Europe for a moment, I mean, do you think there's been a lot of nervousness over Trump? I mean, including on NATO. Would Trump withdraw from NATO, and was it just a good bargaining position that he took with trying to get NATO countries to come up to the 2% of GDP contributions, or was he serious? And then I've talked to other people that said actually he's been more pro-NATO now than maybe earlier on in his term. But in general, there is a sense in Europe, would you say, with the big countries certainly and the cornerstones of NATO, that Trump has just not been a reliable partner, and that they've had to take their own leadership. Like Merkel has said, we've got to lead from Europe. We can't just rely on America to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think this idea that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own defense is becoming more popular over here. I think Trump's, claims about defunding NATO are somewhat empty threats. I don't think he would actually, effectively abolish the alliance, but he has, announced that he's going to be removing, I think, 38,000 troops from Germany. I wouldn't need to double check that figure, but something along those lines. 6,000
essentially because he doesn't like Merkel. And I'll tell you, because I've talked to a lot of people in NATO and the former American commander of US forces in Europe, and it makes no sense because they've just restructured and upgraded a lot of their bases in Germany. And they say, essentially, it is because of the tension he has had with Angela Merkel. And, they're going to move some of those troops to Poland. So it's not, I don't want to create the impression that they're bringing them all back. But a lot of it just comes down to Trump's personality and the way he engaged with Merkel.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think Trump puts a lot of value into his personal relationship with leaders, and that really does impact his relationship and his policy, rightly or wrongly. As we discussed earlier, he has a, not, I wouldn't say close relationship with Putin, but might see a like-minded figure in Putin.
There's a mysterious relationship with Putin at the very least.
Yes, exactly. And that, definitely influences some of his decisions in that respect. Likely that his, not so good relationship with Merkel encouraged him to relocate many of the troops that were stationed there.
He's been doing a series of tweets out of the hospital, vote. One of them was peace through strength, bring our soldiers home, vote. I have no idea what he's talking about there. I assume it's Afghanistan, where, the U.S. has been there since 9/11, and there are peace negotiations, so-called peace negotiations that are going on with the Taliban. But in general, there aren't very many troops left there anyway. There's about 5,000. I think they're down to 3,500 by the election time, and he wants to bring the rest home. A lot of people worry that Afghanistan's just going to turn around, put the Taliban back into power, and those 20 years of fighting, 19 years of fighting, brought us what? I don't know. I mean, the U.S. deconstructed bases that were being used by Al Qaeda, but where does that take us in terms of security in Afghanistan if he's just trying to do these slogans for the election, bring troops home? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have been claims that Trump has spoken very negatively about military families. He's been, he's called them suckers and things like that. So I'm assuming that's his attempt at regaining that vote, in terms of making it clear that he does care about, the troops and the families of the troops. Whether or not that's in the US's best strategic interest, I don't think is. But Trump has, operated in the past based on impulse and not on what his advisors are telling him. So, for example, pulling out troops from Syria in such a hasty manner was really not encouraged, and he did so anyways.
From Syria.
Giving Russia a huge, in Syria, giving Russia a huge strategic victory and really undermining the US's influence in the region. So, like, good or bad, I don't think that it's unlikely that Trump would do that in Afghanistan as well.
I mean, it's very interesting what's happening, because you take a look at some of the international vacuums that have been left under the Trump administration. Libya, where you now have Turkey and Syria backing different warlords and potentially being adversaries, and Syria. And then now also with Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Caucasus. And there are a lot of vacuums that are left by a lack of American leadership. And I don't know if that will return with Biden. Let's leave it there. Do you think that Biden will refill some of those gaps and put America's presence back? Or do you think that we're giving him too much credit without really understanding, his stated foreign policy in those areas? Because he hasn't said a lot. And frankly, the last debate didn't really deal with any of it.
Oh, it didn't. Biden policy wasn't one of the debate topics, but it is quite interesting to look at where different countries did come up. It was around very politicized partisan issues within the states in terms of what was discussed at the debate. I do think Biden will make an attempt to repair relationshirs with allies, especially European allies, and to reassert America's role as a global leader by re-signing up to the Paris Accords, as we discussed earlier, by recommitting funding to the World Health Organization. So doing different things along those lines to strengthen international institutions. I do think that Europe will need to do more to show Biden and the states that they are willing to carry their own weight. So meeting that minimum spend for NATO, taking on more of their defense capabilities. I think the US is getting increasingly more concerned about the rise of China, and that will continue to be one of the major things that the next president, whoever it is, will focus on. And so, Europe needs to decide if they're willing to work with us on those issues, or if they would prefer to, just take a backseat and do their own thing.
Anar Bata, thank you so much. Anar is the coordinator of the U.S. and Americas program at Chatham House. Thank you, Anar.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good job. Thank you so much.
And that's our backstory on U.S. foreign policy. Please subscribe to this podcast and share. I'm Dana Lewis, the host and creator, and I'll talk to you again soon.